Staring defiantly at the letters on her porch, Susan knew it was time to take a stand. After years of backing down to her homeowners association's endless rules, she was done. They had crossed a line, banning her beloved porch chairs, and now she had a brilliant plan for revenge. Little did the snobbish HOA president know, Susan was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The knock on the door sent a jolt of anxiety through Susan. She knew exactly who it would be, the HOA compliance officer, here to harass her yet again. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and opened the door. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm here about the chairs on your porch. You have 48 hours to remove them or face a fine," the officer stated flatly, his tone dripping with disdain. Susan clenched her jaw, years of resentment bubbling to the surface. On what grounds? Those chairs have been there for 10 years. The new guidelines prohibit any furniture on front porches. "It's an eyesore," he replied dismissively. "But my porch is the only place I can sit and enjoy the outdoors. Those chairs bring me so much joy," Susan pleaded, her voice quivering with emotion. The officer shrugged. "Not my problem. You have your warning." As he turned to leave, Susan felt a surge of defiance. "You know what? I'm not taking them down. Come back with your fines. I don't care." The officer paused, his brow furrowing. "Mrs. Johnson, I'd strongly advise you to reconsider. You don't want to cross the HOA." Susan straightened her shoulders, unwavering. "I think I do. This neighborhood has become nothing but rules and misery. It's time someone stood up to you all." With that, she firmly shut the door in his face, feeling a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The HOA had pushed her too far, and now she was ready to fight back. That night, as Susan sat on her beloved porch chairs, sipping her tea, she began formulating a plan. The chairs were more than just a place to relax. They represented her freedom, her individuality in a sea of conformity. She wasn't about to let the HOA take that away. The next morning, Susan woke up with a gleam in her eye. She headed to the hardware store, buying plywood, screws, and hinges. Back home, she got to work, skillfully constructing a sturdy wooden frame. By the afternoon, she had created a perfect replica of her porch chairs. As the compliance officer returned, brandishing a hefty fine, Susan greeted him with a wide smile. "I have good news. I've removed the chairs, just as you asked." The officer eyed her suspiciously. "Well, that's a relief. I'm glad you finally decided to cooperate." "Oh, I'm cooperating all right," Susan replied, stepping aside to reveal her new creation. "Meet my porch display. The chairs are now for sale, right out here on the sidewalk." The officer's mouth fell open, his face flushing with anger. "This is unacceptable. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Susan interrupted, her voice dripping with triumph. "You said no chairs on the porch. You didn't say anything about selling them right here, in full view of your precious HOA." The officer sputtered, his face turning a deep shade of red. "This is blatant defiance of the rules. I'm going to have to report this to the HOA board." Susan smiled sweetly. "Please do. I welcome the opportunity to discuss this with them." As the flustered officer stormed off, Susan felt a surge of exhilaration. She had finally stood up to the tyranny of the HOA, and the adrenaline was coursing through her veins. Later that day, Susan's makeshift porch chair display began attracting curious neighbors. One by one, they approached, drawn by the novelty of her protest. "What's going on here, Susan?" asked her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a kind elderly woman who had always kept her head down when it came to the HOA. "The HOA has banned my porch chairs, can you believe it?" Susan replied, her voice brimming with indignation. "So I decided to sell them right here, in plain sight of their office." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. "Oh my, that's quite bold of you. Aren't you worried about the consequences?" Susan shrugged. "At this point, I don't care. I'm tired of living in fear of these people." It's time someone stood up to them. As the afternoon wore on, more neighbors gathered, drawn by the spectacle. Some expressed admiration for Susan's defiance, while others voiced concerns about the potential fallout. What if they fine you or even try to have you evicted? One neighbor asked, his brow furrowed with worry. Let them try, Susan responded defiantly. This is my home, and I'm not going to let them bully me out of it. Just then, the sound of an engine roared, and a sleek SUV pulled up in front of the display. The door swung open, and the HOA president, Mrs. Wilkins, emerged, her face twisted with fury. Mrs. Johnson, what on earth do you think you're doing? She demanded, striding toward Susan with purpose. Susan stood her ground, her chin held high. I'm selling my porch chairs, Mrs. Wilkins. Since you've banned them from my porch, I figured I'd offer them to the public right here. Mrs. Wilkins' eyes narrowed to slits. This is a flagrant violation of our community guidelines. You have 24 hours to remove this display, or will be forced to take legal action. Susan crossed her arms defiantly. I'm not going anywhere. If you have a problem with it, take it up with the rest of the neighborhood. I'm sure they'd love to hear about your latest power trip. The HOA president's nostrils flared, and for a moment, Susan thought she might explode. But then, a calculating look crossed Mrs. Wilkins' face, and she turned on her heel, heading back to her car. You'll regret this, Mrs. Johnson, she called over her shoulder. Mark my words. As the SUV sped away, the small crowd of onlookers erupted in applause, and Susan felt a surge of triumph. She had drawn a line in the sand, and for once she wasn't backing down. The next morning, Susan woke up to a flurry of activity outside her home. As she peered out the window, she saw several men in suits carrying clipboards, accompanied by a team of burly-looking security guards. Her heart pounding, Susan rushed outside to confront the intruders. What's the meaning of this? She demanded, planting herself firmly in front of her porch chair display. One of the suited men stepped forward, his face a mask of condescension. Mrs. Johnson, I'm afraid we're here to enforce the HOA's decision. This display is in direct violation of our community guidelines, and we're here to ensure its removal. Susan stood her ground, her eyes narrowing. You'll have to go through me first. I'm not taking down a single chair. The man's lips curled into a smug smile. Very well then. Consider this your final warning. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to take legal action against you. With that, the team of men began to move towards the display, their intent clear. Susan braced herself, her heart pounding in her ears. Just then, a familiar car pulled up, and Mrs. Thompson emerged, a look of determination on her face. What's going on here? She demanded, rushing to Susan's side. The HOA is trying to force me to take down my porch chair display, Susan explained, her voice quivering with emotion. Mrs. Thompson turned to the suited men, her eyes narrowing. Well, you'll have to go through me too. I won't stand for this kind of heavy-handed bullying. One of the security guards stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. This is an official HOA matter. But Mrs. Thompson refused to budge, her frail frame belying the steel in her spine. I don't care if it's the Queen of England herself. This is our neighborhood, and we have a right to stand up for ourselves. The confrontation was drawn in a crowd, and soon other neighbors began to gather, their faces etched with a mix of fear and determination. What's going on? One neighbor called out. The HOA is trying to shut down Susan's porch chair display, Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice ringing with defiance. The crowd erupted in a chorus of outrage, and the suited men exchanged nervous glances. Clearly, they had underestimated the depth of feeling in the community. Just then, the sound of a car engine roared, and a familiar black SUV pulled up. Mrs. Wilkins emerged, her face a mask of fury. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, her gaze sweeping over the gathering crowd. Susan stepped forward, her chin held high. "The meaning of this is that we're not going to let you bully us anymore, Mrs. Wilkins. This neighborhood belongs to all of us, not just the HOA." The HOA president's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Susan thought she might lash out. But then, a calculated look crossed her face, and she raised her hand, silencing the crowd. "Very well, Mrs. Johnson," she said, her voice dripping with false civility. "I can see that this has become a matter of community pride. Let's take this to the next HOA meeting, where we can discuss this in a more civilized manner." With that, she turned and swept back to her car, the suited men and security guards trailing behind her. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Susan felt a surge of triumph. She had drawn a line in the sand, and for once, the HOA had backed down. But she knew that the battle was far from over. In the days leading up to the HOA meeting, Susan's porch chair display became a rallying point for the entire neighborhood. Neighbors from all walks of life flocked to her corner, eager to show their support and share their own stories of HOA overreach. Susan quickly realized that her fight was not just about her beloved porch chairs, but about the very soul of the community. The HOA's heavy-handed tactics had sapped the life out of the neighborhood, leaving behind a sterile, conformist atmosphere that was suffocating the residents. As the meeting approached, Susan worked tirelessly to organize her fellow neighbors. She created flyers, circulated petitions, and even reached out to the local media, determined to shine a spotlight on the HOA's abuses. Finally, the day of the HOA meeting arrived, and Susan and a sizable contingent of her supporters filed into the community center, their faces etched with determination. Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA president, stood at the front of the room, her air of superiority as palpable as ever. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. "I understand that there are some concerns regarding the recent changes to our community guidelines, and we're here to address those concerns." Susan's hand shot up, and she didn't wait to be called on. "Mrs. Wilkins, the community guidelines have become nothing more than a tool for you and the HOA board to lord over us. Banning porch chairs? Seriously? What's next? Dictating the color of our front doors?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Mrs. Wilkins' expression darkened. "Mrs. Johnson, I must remind you that these guidelines are in place to maintain the integrity and property values of our neighborhood. Allowing residents to do as they please would only lead to chaos and disorder." "Chaos and disorder?" Susan scoffed. "This neighborhood was vibrant and thriving long before the HOA started cracking down on every little thing. You're sapping the life out of this place, and we're not going to stand for it anymore." More cheers and applause erupted from the crowd, and Susan could see the panic flickering in Mrs. Wilkins' eyes. The HOA president cleared her throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Be that as it may, the porch chair display is a clear violation of our guidelines, and we cannot allow it to continue. I'm afraid we have no choice but to take legal action against you, Mrs. Johnson." The crowd erupted in a chorus of boos and jeers, and Susan could feel the tension in the room reaching a fever pitch. She raised her hand, silencing the crowd with a gesture. "Mrs. Wilkins, if you take legal action against me, I can promise you that this entire neighborhood will fight back. We're not going to let you bully us into submission anymore. This isn't just about my porch chairs, it's about our right to live in a community that respects our individuality and our freedom." The HOA president's face twisted with fury, but before she could respond, a voice from the back of the room rang out. "She's right, you know. We're all sick and tired of your endless rules and restrictions." Susan turned to see Mrs. Thompson, her frail frame radiating defiance. "If you come after Mrs. Johnson, you'll have to come after all of us." The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and Mrs. Wilkins' composure finally crumbled. She glared at Susan, her eyes burning with hatred, and then stormed out of the room, the rest of the HOA board members hurrying to follow her. As the cheers and celebrations continued, Susan felt a sense of triumph. She had finally stood up to the HOA, and she knew that this was just the beginning. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was ready to fight for the soul of her community. In the aftermath of the heated HOA meeting, Susan found herself at the center of a growing movement within the community. Word of her defiance had spread like wildfire, and neighbors from all corners of the neighborhood were flocking to her porch chair display, eager to show their support. As the days passed, the display continued to grow, with Susan and her fellow residents adding chair after chair, each one a symbol of their refusal to be cowed by the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. But the HOA board, led by the increasingly vengeful Mrs. Wilkins, was not about to back down. They began to ramp up their efforts to shut down the display, issuing hefty fines and threatening legal action against Susan and her supporters. One morning, as Susan was arranging the latest batch of donated chairs, she heard the familiar rumble of an engine and looked up to see Mrs. Wilkins' sleek black SUV pulling up to the curb. The HOA president emerged, her face twisted with fury, and strode towards the display. "Mrs. Johnson, I've had enough of this nonsense," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You have 24 hours to remove this display, or we'll be forced to take drastic measures." Susan straightened her shoulders, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Wilkins. This display is a testament to the community's solidarity, and we're not going to let you bully us into submission." Solidarity. Mrs. Wilkins scoffed. "This is nothing more than an act of defiance, and I won't stand for it. You're disrupting the order and tranquility of this neighborhood, and I won't have it." "Order and tranquility?" Susan retorted, her voice rising. "Since when has this neighborhood been orderly and tranquil? Ever since the HOA took over, it's been nothing but a stifling, conformist nightmare." The crowd that had gathered around the display erupted in cheers and applause, and Mrs. Wilkins' face flushed with rage. "That's it, Mrs. Johnson. You leave me no choice," she hissed, whirling around and storming back to her car. Susan watched her go, a sense of foreboding settling in the pit of her stomach. She had a feeling that the HOA president was about to unleash her full wrath, and she couldn't help but wonder what kind of retaliation was in store. True to her word, the next morning, Susan awoke to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling down the street. Peering out the window, she gasped in horror as she saw a crew of workers, accompanied by several police officers, descending on her porch chair display. Within minutes, the display had been dismantled, the chairs loaded onto a truck and carted away. Susan rushed outside, her heart pounding, as the workers and officers began to disperse. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. One of the officers stepped forward, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we've been ordered by the HOA to remove this display. It's considered a public nuisance, and they've obtained a court order to have it taken down." Susan felt a surge of rage wash over her. This is outrageous. You can't just come in and destroy something that belongs to the community. The officer shrugged helplessly. "I'm just following orders, ma'am. If you have any issues, you'll need to take it up with the HOA." As the last of the workers drove away, Susan stood in the empty space where her beloved display had once stood, her fists clenched at her sides. She knew that this was just the beginning of the HOA's retaliation, and she was more determined than ever to fight back. As the sun set on the now vacant space where her porch chair display had once stood, Susan felt a sense of rage and determination coursing through her veins. The HOA's heavy-handed tactics had only served to strengthen her resolve, and she was more determined than ever to fight back against their tyranny. Gathering a group of her most committed neighbors, Susan began to formulate a plan. They would need to find a way to strike back at the HOA, to show them that they couldn't bully the community into submission without facing serious consequences. "We can't just sit back and let them walk all over us," said Mrs. Thompson, her frail frame radiating an unexpected intensity. "They've taken away our right to express ourselves, and we need to find a way to take that power back." Susan nodded, her mind racing. I agree, but we need to be strategic about this. If we just try to defy them head-on, they'll just hit us with more legal action and fines. We need to find a way to hit them where it really hurts. The group fell silent, each of them lost in thought. Finally, one of the younger neighbors, a tech-savvy millennial named Jared, spoke up. "What if we take this battle online?" he suggested, a mischievous glint in his eye. "We could start a crowdfunding campaign to raise money for a legal challenge and use social media to rally support from people all over the country." Susan's eyes widened. "That's brilliant, Jared, and we could use the money to hire a really good lawyer, someone who can take on the HOA and win." The group erupted in excited chatter, and before long, they had a plan in motion. Jared got to work setting up the crowdfunding campaign, while Susan and the others began reaching out to local media outlets, determined to shine a spotlight on the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Within a matter of days, the campaign had gone viral, with thousands of people across the country donating to the cause. The local news stations were clamoring to cover the story, and Susan found herself thrust into the role of reluctant celebrity, her face and story plastered across TV screens and social media feeds. But the HOA board, led by the ever more frantic Mrs. Wilkins, were not about to back down. They responded to the growing public outrage by doubling down on their efforts to shut down the resistance, issuing even more fines and threatening legal action against Susan and her supporters. One day, as Susan was preparing to head to a meeting with their newly hired lawyer, she received a call from an unknown number. Cautiously, she answered, only to be greeted by the snarling voice of Mrs. Wilkins. "Mrs. Johnson, I hope you're enjoying your little moment in the spotlight, because it's about to come to a very abrupt end," the HOA president hissed. "We've obtained a court order to seize your home and property, and you have 48 hours to vacate the premises." Susan felt her blood run cold, her heart pounding in her ears. "You can't do that," she sputtered, her voice shaking with fear and anger. "Oh, but we can," Mrs. Wilkins replied, her tone dripping with malice. "You've defied us at every turn, and now you're going to pay the price. Say goodbye to your precious porch chairs, Mrs. Johnson, because they're about to become the property of the HOA." Before Susan could respond, the line went dead, leaving her trembling with a mixture of terror and outrage. She knew that she had to act fast, but the thought of losing her home was almost too much to bear. Gathering her shaken neighbors, Susan knew that she had to find a way to fight back, no matter the cost. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. As the news of the HOA's impending seizure of Susan's home spread through the community, a sense of outrage and determination took hold. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up against the HOA's tyranny now rallied behind Susan, determined to do whatever it took to stop the eviction. The crowdfunding campaign, fueled by the growing media attention, had raised a substantial amount of money, and the community's newly hired lawyer, a seasoned litigator named Olivia, was ready to take the fight to the HOA. "This is a blatant abuse of power," Olivia declared, her voice ringing with righteous indignation. "The HOA has no legal grounds to seize Mrs. Johnson's property, and we're going to make sure they know it." With Olivia leading the charge, Susan and her neighbors set to work, gathering evidence and preparing their case. They combed through the HOA's bylaws, searching for any loopholes or inconsistencies that they could exploit, and they reached out to local politicians and community leaders seeking their support. As the clock ticked down to the 48-hour eviction deadline, the tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. Neighbors gathered outside Susan's home, forming a human shield against the impending confrontation with the HOA. Finally, the day of the eviction arrived, and a convoy of black SUVs pulled up in front of Susan's house, their occupants spilling out and striding towards the property with a sense of grim determination. At the head of the group was Mrs. Wilkins, her face twisted with a vindictive triumph. "Mrs. Johnson, your time is up," she declared, her voice dripping with malice. "It's time for you to pack up and get out." But as the HOA president and her entourage approached the house, they were met with a wall of defiant neighbors, each one standing firm and refusing to budge. "You're not going to take her home, Mrs. Wilkins," Mrs. Thompson declared, her frail frame belying the steel in her spine. "Not if we have anything to say about it." The HOA president's eyes narrowed, and she turned to the security guards accompanying her. "Remove these people, immediately," she hissed. But the guards hesitated, their eyes darting nervously from the determined faces of the neighbors to the unyielding expression of Mrs. Wilkins. "Ma'am, I'm not sure we can do that," one of the guards said, his voice trembling. "These people are within their rights to be here, and we don't want to risk escalating the situation." Mrs. Wilkins' face flushed with rage, and she opened her mouth to issue a blistering retort. But before she could speak, a well-dressed man emerged from the crowd, his expression calm and authoritative. "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Wilkins," the man said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Olivia Sinclair, the community's legal counsel, and I have a court order that prohibits you from carrying out this eviction." The HOA president's eyes widened in shock, and she whirled around to face Olivia, her fingers flexing as if she was itching to wrap them around the lawyer's throat. "This is an outrage," she spat. "You have no right to interfere in the HOA's affairs." Olivia merely raised a hand, her expression serene. "On the contrary, Mrs. Wilkins, I have every right. The court has found that your actions are a clear violation of Mrs. Johnson's rights, and they've ordered you to cease all further attempts at eviction." As the HOA president's face crumpled with defeat, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, their voices filling the air with a triumphant roar. Susan, her eyes shining with tears of relief, stepped forward and embraced Olivia, her heart swelling with gratitude. The battle had been won, but Susan knew that the war was far from over. The HOA would not give up without a fight, and she would need to be vigilant, ready to defend her home and her community at a moment's notice. In the aftermath of the dramatic standoff with the HOA, Susan found herself at the center of a growing movement within the community. The story of her defiance had captured the public's imagination, and people from all over the country were rallying to her cause, donating to the crowdfunding campaign, and sharing her story on social media. With the temporary injunction in place, Susan and her neighbors were able to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But they knew that the battle was far from over, and that the HOA would stop at nothing to regain control of the situation. Susan's attorney, Olivia, wasted no time in filing a comprehensive lawsuit against the HOA, alleging a pattern of abuse and overreach. The case quickly gained national attention, with legal experts and civil rights advocates weighing in on the broader implications of the conflict. Meanwhile, Susan and her neighbors continued to resist the HOA's efforts to reassert their authority. They organized regular community meetings where they discussed strategies for pushing back against the HOA's restrictive policies and holding them accountable for their actions. One day, as Susan was preparing for another meeting, she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Wilkins herself, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled and her eyes wild with desperation. "Mrs. Johnson, I've come to make you an offer," the HOA president said, her voice trembling. "If you agree to drop the lawsuit and remove your porch chair display, we'll drop all the fines and penalties against you and your neighbors." Susan stared at the woman, her expression unreadable. "And why should I trust you, Mrs. Wilkins, after all the pain and suffering you've caused this community?" The HOA president's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked like a defeated woman. "Because I'm at the end of my rope," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The HOA is facing financial ruin, and our reputation is in tatters. If this lawsuit goes forward, we'll have no choice but to disband the board and start over from scratch." Susan felt a surge of satisfaction at the woman's admission of defeat, but she also couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. After all, the HOA had become a symbol of the community's oppression, and its downfall would have far-reaching consequences. "I'll consider your offer, Mrs. Wilkins," Susan said, her voice measured. "But I can't promise anything. This isn't just about me and my porch chairs anymore. It's about the entire community standing up to your tyranny." Mrs. Wilkins nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I understand. Just, please, think it over. For all our sakes." With that, the HOA president turned and hurried away, leaving Susan to ponder the weight of her decision. Should she accept the offer and bring an end to the conflict, or should she press on, determined to see the lawsuit through to its conclusion? As the days passed, Susan found herself torn between her desire for justice and her sense of responsibility to the community. She knew that if the HOA was forced to disband, it could lead to chaos and uncertainty, and she couldn't bear the thought of causing more harm to the people she cared about. Finally, after much agonizing, Susan made her decision. She called Olivia and informed her of Mrs. Wilkins' offer, and together they crafted a settlement agreement that would not only drop the lawsuit, but also dismantle the HOA entirely, paving the way for a new, more democratic system of community governance. As the news spread through the neighborhood, a sense of relief and cautious optimism took hold. The porch chair display was restored, a symbol of the community's hard-won victory, and Susan found herself at the center of a new movement, one dedicated to building a better, more inclusive future for all. In the end, Susan's defiance had not only saved her own home, but had also sparked a revolution that would change the face of the community forever. And as she sat once more on her beloved porch chairs, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and purpose, knowing that she had made a difference.